All right, another episode of the Brett Code Show, where I talk about what I've been working on and thinking about lately. It's been a good week. Getting a lot done, feeling good. Been doing a lot of scripting with Ruby, which I think I'll show off. I've done a video on that in the past on how nice Ruby is to work with for writing little utility scripts. I think it's also great for prototyping things. It's not ideal for building distributable, portable binaries for command line applications that you can send to anyone and they can run without any dependencies. But they're great if you have Ruby installed. And because you can get things functioning really quickly, I think that's really nice to experiment and try to reach a stable API and then maybe go code it in Rust or Go or something along those lines where you can compile it to a statically linked binary that, anyone on any platform could use. So yeah, I want to share those things, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about where Ruby falls short and some thoughts that I have that are evolving there. The first thing is that I've been working on this Graphql-docs gem that I'm now the maintainer of, and I built out a CLI, which I've covered option parser in the past when building a Ruby gem. And so I just use that. Requires no external dependencies because it's baked into the standard library. And it gives you a really nice parser for options. Doesn't support the most complex use cases, but for this, where it's a command line that only does one thing, it's a command line interface that only does one thing, it doesn't have subcommands or anything. It's not Git, for example. It works really well. So if I'll just run it directly. If I run that, we have an error. Oh, I have to run it with Ruby ilib. It says schema must be specified. You can pass in the help args, and it outputs that details, the usage, description, how to use it, different arguments. And I've got a schema file. It's in test fixtures, test GraphQL-docs fixtures, tiny schema GraphQL. So I can run that, and then in the output directory, that site was generated. So I think I can open output index.html, and it's not loading the styles because of how things are served, but anyways, it's all there. It's just viewing it locally is a little different. But yeah, that is that. And it was, really quick and simple to build. I'll open up that code again, but really what it does is it takes in the options and it passes it to this builder class that already existed in this library. And I can support more options if needed in the future, but I got that working. That was fun. And in the vein of CLIs, I established a bin directory. So if I go to my GitHub at github.com/bretchalupa/bin, it's just the place I'm putting little scripts I use to share it with others. I usually use Ruby for these because, like I said, Ruby's really quick and I know it well. Spell check is kind of neat. It just takes a file, a glob of files, and loops through them and calls the spell command to spell check. So when I'm working on Projectbook, if I go to Projectbook, I can run the spell check command. And let's say I want to do it on source, CLIs, ***MD. Maybe it's just *MD. It goes through and I can check everything for typos and with the spell command. So that was that was pretty nice. There's not a good way to cancel out if you're in the middle of checking a bunch of files. So that's a shortcoming of it. But that's the spell check script, which is one of these first ones I added. I added one called GBL, so Git branch list. This comes from a coworker, Max. He has a version where each branch gets a number, and then you type in the number, but I want an interactive one. So you can type GBL and it shows you all the branches that you're not on, so you can easily switch to them. This is nice if your branch names are prefixed with an issue ID or anything that's hard to remember and type out. So I like the interactive switcher. And all that does is it uses the TTY prompt gem, which is a great library. Gets all your branches, splits them, deletes the current one, and then lets you select it, and then it calls git checkout with that branch. So really simple, right? This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines of code. Makes a nice little extension for Git. So that's GBL. I use that all the time, and it's just a Ruby rewrite of a Bash version that's now interactive. And that's GBL, and then concom is, I guess, the main thing I want to show, which is this thing. There's conventional commits, which I talked about in the last episode, and I've been using. And at work, we've started to use them too. So I wanted a way to make it really easy to write conventional commits that follow the standard, which is that commit messages have a type, a scope, a description, and then an optional body. Let's see if we can find an example. Here's an example. Feature, API, bang means there's a breaking change, and then the description, and then you can write out the body. So I really wanted an easy way to do that, so I made concom. So I'll just go in here and I'll make a diff and then add that. Now if I do concom, which is short for conventional commit, I also have an alias for it for GC, it shows an interactive commit type select. So we'll just say chore, and for the scope, I'll just say docs. I'll say update readme. Press enter, you can enter whether or not it's a breaking change, which we'll put the bang, and we'll put yes just to show that. And then it opens it up in Git with a pre-filled template of the message. Or not Git, it opens it up in Vim, whatever your editor is set to. And then you can write more info here about the change, and you can describe the breaking change, like blah, blah, blah. You can save it, and then it creates the Git commit. So if I show head, it has that all properly formatted. That's, really been useful. I've been using it at work. It's quite a nice way to ensure that you don't have typos when you're writing feat or chore or whatever the type is. And the code is not the best code. It's really sequential Ruby code that uses that same TTY prompt gem. But basically what it does is it creates a default config. There's a support for overriding the config, which I'll show. And then it goes through and asks you the questions. It then writes, if you have the editor env set, it then writes it to a temp file, opens that file in your editor, and then when you save it, it reads it, and then, or when you save it, it writes it to that file. Then the temp file is used to write the git commit message, and then we delete the temp file. Otherwise, it uses standard in. So not a ton of code, right? About 100 lines, and not that the lines of code necessarily matters, but what I'm just trying to say is that it was really simple to do this. Working with Ruby was nice because I can flesh out this API and the commands and how it works. And then, but the thing is, if you don't use Ruby, it's not super easy for you to install. So the plan is to get this stable, and then I'll rewrite it in Rust using the dialogger crate, which has similar functionality to the TTY prompt that will allow for building an interactive conventional commit creator. And I've got a very rough version of that working, but I switched to Ruby because it was much faster. Then I'll go back and I'll finish the Rust version. Don't know if I'll keep calling it concom because it's kind of a silly name, but it's clear what it is. It's the abbreviation of conventional and commit. So I'm on the fence about what to call it. But I think it's helpful because of it. I think it's helpful to write it in Rust so it can be easily distributed. I'll show the config because I think that's somewhat of an interesting feature. So if you create a concom-config JSON file, you can specify your scopes. So, a given application will have different scopes. So you just have an array, and maybe your scopes are, like users, dashboard. And you can also then turn off breaking changes, because maybe like you work in an application where breaking changes isn't a feature that exists because it's like a web app and you just deploy it. You can save that, and then when you run concom, I'll git add p, I'll add the concom config. Wow, sorry, I'm having a hard time. Now if I concom, and let's say feat, you see it has users, dashboard, custom if you want to enter custom one, or none if you want none. And there's a setting where you can turn off none as an option, so you have to have a scope if you want that. And you can type whatever, save it, and yeah. So, and it didn't ask if it was a breaking change because we have that functionality disabled. So I think that's kind of neat. It's right now it's just this Ruby script, and I think as we use it more at work and as I use it more, I'll let it stabilize and then rewrite it in Rust, make it easy to distribute, and see if other people use it. I know there's a TypeScript version, TypeScript conventional commit tool, or maybe a JS version. Commitlint, which I think is pretty similar, but okay, so that checks the commits, which is, yeah, it's similar in nature, but the fact that it's an NPM script is kind of unfortunate, because if you're writing code and you don't have Node installed and you don't want to use NPM, you're kind of limited. And I don't think that this would warrant installing NPM. So yeah, I think there's a need for it or a use for it. Maybe there's something else that exists. I don't want to look too closely. It might be demotivating because I'm having fun working on it, but that's concom, that's GBL, that's scripting with Ruby, and I think Ruby is really great for this, right? Like, if you look at this script, you can go through it, read it, really easy to have a default config, parse the loaded JSON if the override exists, and then mash them together. Like, Ruby's so great for that. I think when you're working on something as an experiment or something that's like low key, not a ton of lines of code that's not being maintained by a bunch of people, and you can just kind of hack away at it, Ruby really excels, and I like it for that way, for those things. But I've been just thinking about where Ruby falls short, and I think when you're working on a big project where there's lots of classes and objects, a ton of functions, and you're loading data from the database, especially in a big Rails project, is that not having type safety and not having really good documentation on what different methods and classes and actions exist is really exhausting and dizzying. And the more that I work in TypeScript, which I have been working more and more in, the more I really enjoy it, especially when collaborating with others. So it's like, not that I don't think Ruby should exist or something, but I just find myself like, when I'm working on a serious project, like at work or, a personal project that I want to take really seriously, having the confidence of the types and language server really makes a big difference. I've noticed that with TypeScript and with learning Rust, and finding the compiler to be a really helpful aid when coding rather than a hindrance. And it may slow you down a little bit, but with TypeScript, once I got past the learning curve, I felt really productive and really great working with it. You still fight the compiler a little bit trying to express more complex types, but the more and more experience I get with it, the better it is. And I find myself kind of dreading when I have to work in Ruby and Rails for certain things. But for these kind of scripts, it's great. So it's like, I don't know, I tend to think about that stuff as like you have a toolbox and maybe you have a hand, driver that you use, and that's great for certain things, but sometimes you need your power drill. And knowing which tool to pick for a given project is a really important part of becoming a better developer. So feeling a little low energy today, but having fun sharing and talking about these things still. I'm continuing to work on the GraphQL-Docs gem and getting ready for that, releasing that CLI and some other improvements there. I've got videos coming up more on RSpec to wrap up the advanced RSpec series, and then I've got some videos coming up about the human side of software development, which you'll see, and more coming up. I did finish version 1 of Projectbook, so I've talked about this enough, so I won't share much more about it. But yeah, I got it with 109 projects online, free. I shared it online. People seem to be excited about it. In particular, I shared it on Hacker News, and it got some love. So I thought that was really, really nice. Let's see. So I submitted it on Hacker News, and it got 112 points. I don't really know what points mean. They don't mean much to me, but just to see people view it and check it out and have some positive feedback was reassuring. And I think there was even, maybe some people found the GitHub and starred it. Yeah, it has 49 stars, which is like, that's cool. I don't know what stars really get you. They don't get you much, but they're definitely not paying the bills, but I appreciate stars and people checking it out. That's really what I want, because it's a free resource, and I just want people to have good ideas for projects if they're feeling uninspired. That's it. I think that's all I got for this episode. Thanks, as always. See you next time. Appreciate you watching. Take care. Bye.